One of my biggest concerns that I'd like to share today with you is the fragmentation and stovepiping of mitigation interests. And another concern I've had has been the huge problem that to the extent we have mitigation initiatives, they seem to be overly dependent on the whims of the federal government's budget process. When I became Seattle's emergency management director in 1992, and believe me, I will end up talking about the subject here, it wasn't very long before I heard the term mitigation in a disaster context. Of course, it came up in the emergency manager's litany of key elements: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Despite a lot of attempts to substitute other words for mitigation over the years, who can forget prevention and protection and a whole bunch of other things that came up, there are signs that mitigation as a term has survived both in concept and in the lexicon, and it still has a distance to travel to be in full flower in our country. When I entered my profession back in 1992, I found numerous indications that response was well understood, that recovery was understood but rarely effectively carried out in the eyes of citizens, that there was a lot of hot air being expelled over community preparedness, and while mitigation made sense before and after disaster, I saw little evidence of its application. Now, I was in an urban environment. Not much that had happened in Seattle that was flood-related that anyone could remember. Responsibility was lodged not with emergency management, but with our building department in terms of the NFIP, for example. So I began thinking about mitigation in the context of earthquakes. How could we forestall the negative impacts of an earthquake? I spent a fair amount of time from 1992 to 1997 trying to develop a full-service agenda for the 4 elements of emergency management. Frankly, all needed considerable work, and that work required resources. It seemed clear that disaster readiness begins with a pre-disaster acknowledgement of the vulnerabilities, followed by preparing the community and the government to take protective measures so the response and the recovery would be less complicated. And then it made sense to mitigate the risks that existed, shoring up the observed weak spots and redoubling preparedness efforts, exercising response, and so on. It's never been a straight line, it's been a circle. My problem was anyone at FEMA or national conferences wanted to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about at those conferences. It didn't have much to do with earthquakes. Despite a growing scientific acknowledgement that Washington State and Seattle was in a very hot earthquake zone, second in the nation behind only California. I hear the Midwest is now trying to wedge in there. Welcome, they're welcome. I may even have said I was tired of flood talk, in full disclosure. A lot of times if the thing that you're worried about just can't get any traction, you get irritated with the other topics that are getting traction. But my opportunity to address my biggest nightmare, earthquakes, arrived when the city of Seattle became a Project Impact pilot city. The key to that successful enterprise was the local control over the approach to locally acknowledged risks or hazards that threatened the social equilibrium. And with local control, I had $1 million to spend at my discretion. So I got a lot smarter just with $1 million than I did before I had it. We used that money to provide structural and non-structural mitigation in Seattle's public schools. Just prior to the Nisqually earthquake, it did save lives, despite what the former vice president announced. And we retrofitted residential homes, began a disaster resistance toolkit business assistance program that it survives to this day only because a group of nonprofits took it after my successor abandoned it, and they've done a good job with that toolkit. And we also had the USGS wanted to be a part of us so badly that without using any money, they used our name and our resources to develop seismic and landslide hazard maps for our urban area, which were pretty advanced at the time. Now, James Lee Witt understood that every community had a unique set of hazards, and there was no one way to address these, and no one's biggest threat was greater than any other community's biggest threat, so locals should determine where they would make their stand. And so we achieved some good success in our disaster mitigation program using Project Impact funds. And when I left Seattle, we had a functioning program in pre- and post-disaster mitigation, community preparedness, response, and recovery. And about the time we were beginning to show results of a community-based mitigation program, the new administration in 2001 launched a concerted effort to reduce or even eradicate mitigation programs. The current administration is talking a better game. It's actually used the word mitigation in PDD 8. Some of you might shrug and say, so what? But when I reflect on where we were a few years ago, I think it's on balance a positive step, even if FEMA has yet to really focus on mitigation, as one hopes and expects that they should, and I believe they will. But we can't ask them to do it all, and we have no reason to leave it to them anyway. It's our job. But who should speak up, and which program do we defend in a time of limited and diminishing resources? Who loses out? Now, as NEMA's mitigation chairman from 06 to 10, before I became NEMA vice president and then suddenly president, I sat through my own committee meetings watching mitigation become disconnected from its link to preparedness, response, and recovery. You know, we parse our descriptions of grants for purposes of defending individual grants. We have to save PDM, we have to do this, we have to do that. We fought for the life of programs, and I don't think we emphasize the economic and social health of the communities that are benefiting from those programs. In tough budget times, I tell emergency management audiences that what's at stake is the very future of our profession. And I think that same thing could be said for mitigation. So as we look to, if we want to have a future, we need to think about a few things. You see, if we only talk about mitigation in narrow terms, pre-disaster mitigation, post-disaster mitigation, flood preparedness, earthquake preparedness, it will be perceived as a series of individual narratives by the appropriators who make all the difference. We're never going to achieve the right balance between the need and the funding levels if we don't start talking more holistically about this. And if we don't engage with local communities and their decision makers so that they are demanding mitigation, not as a federal requirement, but as a local community development asset, we will be left behind when funding decisions are made. If we don't spell this out for the country, who can blame anyone for not understanding it? Mitigation, response, recovery, and preparedness are part of the emergency management supply chain. One break anywhere in that link, and we're nowhere near as good as we need to be.